So thank you for joining us for the fifth installment of the History of American Architecture lecture series. My name again is Greg Whitcup, and I'm the director of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. At the core of the center's mission is the stewardship, care, and interpretation of Cranbrook's historic campus, in particular the buildings and interior spaces and landscapes that we define as cultural heritage areas. It is out of this mission, one that stresses both spotlighting and sharing these treasures with audiences near and far, that the History of American Architecture lecture series developed. For those of you that missed the lecture last week or are joining us for the first time this week, don't worry. We are recording the lectures and we'll be sending out a link to all of our participants very soon. Before I reintroduce our guide to the history of architecture and the story of Eero Saarinen, I would like to once again thank our sponsor, the Smith Group, including Senior Vice President Jeff Hausman and Vice President and Design Director Paul Urbanik, who I saw on the screen. Although they are a global architectural firm with 16 offices around the world, their roots are here in Detroit, where an architect by the name of Sheldon Smith opened an office in 1855. To all of our friends at the Smith Group, thank you for continuing to support the work of the center. Well, I promise I won't do this before the final three lectures. I now would like to reintroduce just one more time the curator and architectural historian that will be guiding us through the world of Eero Saarinen. Kevin Atkinson joined the center in 2016 as our collections fellow, and over the next 5 years quickly rose to the rank of curator. While I think of Kevin as a Renaissance man, a curator whose intellectual curiosity is seemingly boundless, his passion is for architecture and the built environment. A native of North Georgia, Kevin holds a BA in architecture from Yale and an MA in American Material Culture from the University of Delaware's Winterthur program. Before coming to Cranbrook, Kevin worked for Robert A.M. Stern Architects in New York as a research and writing associate, and at Kent Bloomer Studio in New Haven, where he designed and fabricated architectural ornament. As most of you already know, he is an extremely knowledgeable and engaging guide to American architecture. In short, you are in for another treat this evening. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for being here tonight for another entry into our 5-week study of Eero Saarinen and his circle. Tonight, we have the pleasure of talking about Eero Saarinen's first major project, what really put him on the map. In his own words, it turned him from a young and up-and-coming architect into an established major player on the architectural scene. And that is, of course, the General Motors Technical Center. Now, I would have been unable to do tonight's talk without the recent publication by Susan Skarsgård, Where Today Meets Tomorrow, A History of the Technical Center. I want to thank Susan for all of her efforts in producing this book. She began at General Motors Design in 1994, designing emblems and nameplates, and then she became the founding director of the General Motors Design Archive. I've taken many of my stories as well as images from this book tonight, as well as the archives at General Motors, Yale, Cranbrook, and the Library of Congress. I also want to thank Jim Haefner, who photographed the Technical Center for this book, and who will see many of his amazing color images tonight. Now, last week, we began our 5-week study with a building that you probably didn't know too much about, a real gem in Buffalo, but also a building that is probably more indebted to Eliel Saarinen than Eero Saarinen, though I hope we saw that it very much was a collaboration. Tonight, we get into the Technical Center before moving forward into these other landmarks of mid-century modern design. Now, Kleinhans was an interesting place to start because, like Cranbrook, it is a project that's really developed sort of during World War II when not a lot of architecture was getting built, but it's also really the end of a certain style of architecture, of traditional masonry construction and traditional design elements. Tonight, we are going to enter the post-war optimistic period of American design. And last week, we ended on the competition to design the Jefferson National Memorial Expansion Park in St. Louis. And of course, we think of the Gateway Arch as being an Eero Saarinen design, but even at the early phase in the competition of 1947, it really was a team effort. And here on the original competition boards, if we zoom in, we can see a small landscape sketch by Dan Kiley, as well as other sketches and parts of the project that would have included murals by Alexander Gerard and sculpture grouping by Lily Swan Saarinen. And I want to start with this image tonight because this is showing us the transition of Eero Saarinen from an architect who's working under his father and working with a lot of Cranbrook classmates into the 1950s when Eero has separated formally from Cranbrook and his father passes away in the summer of 1950. And we're going to see the circle really change into a much more a circle that doesn't have its roots in Cranbrook, but instead is being drawn to work for Eero Saarinen specifically. I want to start tonight by doing a walkthrough of the General Motors Technical Center. I know some of you on the screen tonight have had the pleasure of working at the Tech Center or visiting it, but it is a hard place to get to. It is where General Motors does their design, and it is locked down like Fort Knox. And yet, in the 1950s, it was one of the most celebrated works of American architecture. At its dedication in 1956, there had already been at least 18 articles published in national magazines on the Technical Center. Art in America called it the greatest architectural phenomenon of our time. Architectural Forum said that these don't look like buildings as we know them. They are the result more like an exalted industrial product. And Life magazine dedicated a 2-page color spread to the project and said, "Architecture of the future, GM constructs a Versailles of industry." And these buildings at the Tech Center are really so influential and change the course of American building so significantly that it's difficult to today appreciate how unusual the campus was for the time. Now, General Motors, in their extensive PR, came up with this tagline, "Where today meets tomorrow." And the whole project really was a collaboration not only of Eero Saarinen and his associates, but also designers in Metro Detroit, and especially a collaboration with designers at General Motors. The campus is phenomenally large, over 900 acres, though Eero was just building on one portion of that. And the project appealed to Eero Saarinen because it was a chance for him to put technical innovations and mass production into the service of architecture in a way that early modernists in the 20s and 30s had imagined doing, but rarely had the opportunity to produce an architecture that really uses the advances of industry and production. The campus is debatably overwhelming in scale. It features some 25 buildings that house 5,000 employees, and some of these buildings are over 3,000 feet long. It is very exciting in a car to drive through the campus, and it's exciting in photographs. Debatably, it's not the most thrilling place to walk, again, because the scale of it is just so vast. And so the fact that it was hard to get to is hard to get to, but it lives on in the imagination of photographs, I think is part of the architectural power, that it represents something new in America and new in architecture. While the GM Tech Center is very much a working, inventing place of design, for our purposes today, in a history of architecture context, and in the context of Eero Saarinen's specific legacy in modern architecture, I would like to gently propose that the Tech Center should be understood as a kind of sophisticated series of theaters. Partly because it does have moments that are pure theater, like the styling dome seen here, and other places because, in other ways, because Eero Saarinen creates moments in his version of modern architecture that are explicitly intended for a sort of performance, an encounter of architecture and the human, of the worker and the buildings. And so the campus is at once quite rigorous and abstract, a sort of modular-based engineering tour de force, and at other times, in an opposite manner, it is a series of sort of dramatic, haptic set pieces. When we look inside the styling dome, it really is a theater stage for automobiles, a 186-foot wide diameter clear span inside an aluminum sheath dome with bright, uniform daylight coming across, or artificial daylight coming across a perforated metal ceiling. And this is a device that was popularized in 20th century theater in the cyclorama. And it's quite possible Eero Saarinen would have even seen a cyclorama like this at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York in 1933, where his professor in theater design at Yale designed a stage set for Salome in a very similar manner. And it's interesting that Eero then uses this very dramatic sort of way of lighting and creating a theater in the round here for the advancement of the automobile. The dome is just one element that breaks free from what is an otherwise rigorous 5-foot grid. And these elements are sort of breaking, they're alien from the modular fabric. These opposites of curved forms and rectilinear forms give the campus a sense of sort of delight and a disregard for more orthodox or quote unquote pure modernisms. And even when he does build a 3,000-foot long glass and steel building, Eero Saarinen terminates it with a glazed brick wall. In the Cranbrook tradition, he uses a handmade, hand-cast brick, this time glazed in bright colors. And they contribute to this element of surprise as one drives or walks around the campus. These large, colorful walls with extraordinary texture and this real handmade quality begin to stop the otherwise unrelenting modularity of the gridded buildings and gridded landscape. In an otherwise analytical space, the end walls function as these moments of sort of creative and emotional discharge, where this sort of interjection of color and handicraft contributes to an overriding sense of sort of joy and humanity to a place dedicated to advancements in engineering and technology. And so Saarinen invests this theatrical sensibility from the repeated series of domes and water towers, fountains, and brick walls into this sort of gridded design. And then when you move into the buildings, what are really quite simple rectangular shapes, glass curtain walls, you pass into the styling building past Antoine Pevsner's The Flight of the Bird, and you enter into a room where you have an illuminated plastic ceiling and you have a travertine floor, modern furniture, and then there is this sort of stage off to the side. And this stage, enclosed on three sides, is the performance of going up into the actual styling laboratories. You look at the stairway, it's floating on water, and you have travertine steps supported by these very thin wires. And the whole thing has a slight move to it. And you begin to hesitate before stepping out onto this physically floating staircase. And then as you head up underneath these spotlights, illuminated as if you are on a stage, you are surrounded by the sort of handmade brick, glazed brick, the glimmering of the steel supports, and then the sort of smell and sound of chlorinated water. It really is this very physical experience as you rise up this very soft stair tread. Opposite the styling building and the research building, these molded plywood ceiling panels introduce a grid of circles. We saw the circle in the water tower in the styling dome, and these circles lead us to this circular stairway. Designed by Kevin Roche, it is this study in sort of counterbalance, where you have huge slabs of Norwegian granite that are supported on these tiny, almost bicycle spoke steel rods. And then as you climb up the treads, you are being quite physically taught this sort of engineering principle, the logic of how it steps up, because it does feel a bit like this thing is somewhat of a miracle that it is still floating there. And as one is moving up and down the steps, you can choose sort of any position on the step for whatever size footfall you have. And so as you go up and down, you feel the stairs move underneath you, but you also feel anyone else on the stairway. And so it is this haptic interaction of your weight and gait with the stone stairway and the metal supports. And you're quite immediately and involuntarily brought into this intimate connection to the physical building. And this is the sort of theatrical drama that I think is a signature of Eero Saarinen's architecture. These lobbies are the most dramatic examples of his sort of use of sculptural forms in the building, but they do continue at the scale of the whole campus, where he uses the ventilation systems of the building to act as architectural markers, whether these are some sort of abstracted colonnade or sort of figural pillars out in the landscape, painted bright blue under a color scheme devised by Alexander Gerard that coordinates all of the sort of internal pipes and ventilations, and then again framed by this these walls, curtain walls of glass and brick walls of glazing. It is a dialogue between the sort of logic and engineering, as well as this sort of wonderfully whimsical nature of sculpture and of personality. Saarinen would write that the question of how a building can convey emotion is the very purpose of architecture's significance. For a building to express emotion, he wrote, it is central that the concept has to be exaggerated and overstated and repeated in every part of the interior so that whatever you are, inside or outside, the buildings sing with the same message. And I think that's a variation on his father's famous edict to always design to the next largest and the next smallest thing. It is Eero Saarinen saying that if you have a concept, if your concept is a technical center, then every element of that building should reinforce the concept. And I would argue that his concept here is one of efficiency and one of sort of style, humanity and engineering. And this sort of conversation of rigorous engineering with symbolic needs parallels car cultures, with cars representing both precision engineering and imaginative styling. And that is what GM in the 1950s was best known for. Does a car need a tail fin? No. But do tail fins add a sort of desire element to this otherwise heavily engineered machine? Yes. And I think that is what Saarinen is doing with his campus as well, combining engineering rigor with moments of great whimsy and sort of just alluring, seductive design. And even when we look at the advertisements that General Motors produces at this time, we see the sort of combination of a silk evening gown and gloves with the sort of polished chrome and steel of the car. Again, these ideas of hard and soft, masculine and feminine, engineering and art. So Saarinen sets up a system at General Motors that is based on a grid, which he then interrupts with these sort of interludes of shapes and texture and materials. And it engages in this sort of familiar cultural plot of technology in service of gratification. And I think that's a great difference from Eero Saarinen's architecture from his predecessors in Europe in the modern movement, where often modernism was more of a moral monologue of sort of constructional truth, that a building could be truthful. Eero Saarinen says, you can use technology, you can use rigor, and you can sort of create a more spiritual satisfaction and desire. As Saarinen said, our architecture will stay an empty dance if it is simply a formal exercise without emotional meaning. I think that architect and client were very much in agreement with these desires to make the campus seductive and artistic. And when you look at the early publications about the buildings, you see General Motors really sort of celebrating this as if it were some sort of exotic destination, this sort of automobile retreat where today meets tomorrow. Now, Eero Saarinen said that General Motors is a metalworking industry. It's a precision industry. It is a mass production industry. All of these things, Saarinen said, should be expressed in the architecture of the technical center. The design is based on the steel and metal of the automobile, put together as on an assembly line out of mass-produced units. And down to the smallest details, we will give the architecture a precise, well-made look, which is the proud characteristic of industrial America. And so we'll see throughout today's lecture this balance between precision engineering, industrial America, and a real sort of lyrical, artistic inclination. Now, I'm grateful to my former thesis advisor, Sandy Eisenstadt, for introducing this reading of the Technical Center as a sort of theatrical enterprise. And when I send out my reading list for this course at the end of the lecture series, I'll make sure to point out his essay, which expands upon these ideas of Eero Saarinen as an architect of theater. In order to provide a little bit more setting for tonight's lecture, because we have fast forwarded. If last week we started at Eero's birth in 1910 and ended about 1940, we are now in the roaring 1950s. And I wanted to start with the reminiscence of a Eero Saarinen and Associates photographer, Richard Knight, who in his memoir described his arrival to Eero Saarinen and Associates as being right in the midst of this sort of important moment in American culture, from at top left, rock and roll, to McCarthyism in the news, to the fountainhead sort of leading one idea of the architect as genius, to shows like Mr. Ed, whose owner William was also an architect. It was also a time of extraordinary expansion into the suburbs, with neighborhoods like Levittown in New York and Pennsylvania adding some 17,500 identical gabled roofed houses, little boxes, in this racially segregated community. Meanwhile, Detroit was thriving as the fourth largest city in the US. Its architecture rivaled that of New York or Chicago because of the wealth generated by industry. Giffords and Valet, with Gino Rossetti as the design lead, was the largest architecture firm in the United States, with 800 employees based here in Detroit. Close behind it was the office of Albert Kahn and Associates, whose industrial buildings were landmarks in the history of industrial architecture. And also Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, another one of America's largest architecture firms based right here in Detroit. And all of these firms were beginning to break free from traditional styles and Beaux-Arts teaching methods and design methods into a new sort of phase of the modern movement. Now, those massive downtown Detroit firms were quite different from the firm of Eliel Saarinen, J. Robert F. Swanson, and Eero Saarinen. The firm was small. When the Tech Center Commission came in, there were only about 10 full-time employees. In 1947, J. Robert F. Swanson split off from his father-in-law and brother-in-law. And in 1953, Eero Saarinen and Associates moved across the street on Long Lake into a little two-story building designed by Glenn Paulson with Eero Saarinen. There was no organization in the studio. There were less than 20 employees in 1953. It was more of a design atelier with sort of technical experts and architects. Eero did not assign titles in the office. Instead, everyone knew each other by their first names. And employees came from Argentina, Australia, Britain, Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, and Turkey. The office was a sort of interesting reversal of most architects who will practice. Their architecture firm will be in a building they rent, and they will live in a house they design. Eero Saarinen lived in a little Victorian farmhouse, and he worked in a building of his own design. But he also practically lived at the office, as commemorated by cartoonist Claude DeForest with Eero's all-night drive-in here. Now, last week we saw the circle was really centered around Saarinen's family, his mother, father, sister, and brother-in-law, as well as people like Charles Eames and Ralph Rapson, classmates at Cranbrook. Tonight, the circle expands into the formalized Eero Saarinen and Associates. One of the first employees who worked for Eliel and Eero and stayed on throughout Eero's career was Joe Lacey, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, recommended to Eero by Louis Kahn. Eero would write to different professors around the country asking for the best students from their School of Architecture. And Lacey came on to be project manager of the GM Tech Center and would stay on as the sort of business lead architect in the firm. Next was Warren Plattner, who had worked with Raymond Loewy in New York City alongside Minoru Yamasaki. Plattner came to Detroit, hired by Yamasaki to work for Smith, Hinchman and Grills, and then turned around and began work at Eero Saarinen and Associates, where he led the interiors of the technical center. In 1950, John Dinkeloo, a graduate of the University of Michigan, came from the office of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in Chicago, and 2 weeks later, Kevin Roche was hired. A young Irish architect, he had been in the US for 2 years, studying with Mies van der Rohe at IIT, and then working with Harrison and Abramovitz on the United Nations building in New York. When he learned about Eero Saarinen and applied for the job, Roche recalled, "I didn't want to go to Detroit. I thought it was the very end of the world, but it really was the center of architectural development at that moment in time in America. The idea of design teams originated in Detroit." And in Roche's recollection there, he presents the idea of a design team. And that is very much what Eero Saarinen was building in his office. And Roche would remain the right-hand man of design for Eero Saarinen for the rest of his career. And in our last lecture, we'll talk more about how Roche and Dinkeloo finish Eero Saarinen's buildings after his untimely death and will become the successor firm of Eero Saarinen and Associates. As the General Motors project takes off, we get a sort of cavalcade of important architects coming to work for Eero, including the Finnish architect Olaf Hammarström, who came to America to be the design architect of Alvar Aalto's Baker Dormitory at MIT. Then Glenn Paulson from Wisconsin, who had worked for Eliel and would become Cranbrook's third president and head of the architecture department. There was also Gunnar Burkerts, who was a Latvian architect, and Robert Venturi worked for Saarinen for about 2 years. Venturi worked on the General Motors Technical Center, working on entrance pavilions, and he actually did not like working for Eero Saarinen. And if you know much about Robert Venturi, who will go on to be one of the founding intellectuals of the postmodern movement, his critique of Eero seems rather ironic. Venturi found Eero Saarinen's style for the job methodology, the fact that Eero could not build 2 buildings that were alike because no 2 commissions were alike, to be a sort of disservice to the modern movement. And Venturi felt that there should in fact be some style, some principle that Eero worked towards. Of course, later in life, Venturi would reflect that in fact, Eero Saarinen was doing exactly what Venturi was doing, which was to expand the modernist canon to accept all different types of style and expressions. Now, the firm would change significantly in 1954 when Eero Saarinen divorced his first wife, Lily, and married the art critic Aline Saarinen. And Aline was a critic, writer, reporter for the New York Times, which she did a profile on Eero Saarinen, and then shortly thereafter married him about 68 years ago tomorrow. They were a dynamic pair, and she ran PR for the office. Now, this is a circle made up of a lot of white male architects, but there were women involved in Eero Saarinen Associates. I think it's interesting that there were a lot of women designing for Eero Saarinen and Associates, but very few, if any, employed by Eero Saarinen and Associates. And it reflects the gender norms of the day that architecture was a male-dominated field. Because we are going to be talking about many of the architects associated with Eero Saarinen in the next lectures, tonight I'm going to focus more on these women designers and their contributions to Eero Saarinen's circle and to the General Motors Technical Center. In context of what the Tech Center was, after World War II, where General Motors had been on a war footing as part of the arsenal of democracy, GM's executives Alfred P. Sloan and Charles Ketterling planned to return to civilian business and satisfy a pent-up demand of consumer products in automobiles and home goods. And they felt that it was imperative that GM have a new facility for design and research. General Motors was based out of this Beaux-Arts steel frame skyscraper designed by Albert Kahn. And Sloan and Ketterling really were great innovators. Sloan became General Motors president in 1923. He reorganized the company for more efficient operations, and he established things that are now standard in the auto industry, like annual model changeovers and the idea of a car for every purse and purpose, as he liked to say. He pushed styling as a way to distinguish cars for buyers, and he also pushed for the importance of styling for General Motors buildings. Charles Kettering was an inventor. He invented the electric self-starter in 1912, leaded gasoline, lacquers and enamels, Freon, high compression engines, all the way through the 1940s, he was inventing for GM. And Susan Skarsgård, the historian of the Tech Center, wrote that Ketterling was perhaps the most single important figure in the history of the corporation. And the fundamental idea of what the GM Tech Center could be originated in correspondence between Kettering and Sloan. Now, the other great figure in this GM executive suite was Harley Earl, a California-based industrial designer with the reputation for building custom Cadillacs for Hollywood elites. His father was a carriage builder, and GM hired him to design the 1927 LaSalle, which you see here. He was hired on to establish a styling department to compete with the engineering department, and Earl built up a department of architects, interior decorators, and illustrators who worked out of the Argonaut building for General Motors. And it was Earls who introduced sort of tail fins, hidden headlamps, electric windows, the pillarless hardtop wraparound windshields. He really is an icon of automobile design history. And the firm decides that the Tech Center will not be in the city of Detroit. Instead, it will be 30 minutes in some direction from downtown Detroit, and they settle on an undeveloped rural spot of Macomb County in Warren. They purchase 88 acres in 1944 that will go up by 800 acres in 1951. Now, Sloan and Kettering understood the importance of architecture for the image, spirit, and the sort of morale and vision of a company, but they very much disagreed about what that architecture should be. On the one hand, the architecture could reflect the company's priority of style and advanced sort of design ethos. But Kettering, our great inventor, he wanted something more serious and rigorous. He did not want what he kept calling frivolous architecture. And so on the left, you have General Motors at the World's Fair with Norman Bel Geddes and Albert Kahn's incredible sort of streamlined, modern festival of the future, Futurama. And on the right, Albert Kahn's greatest, in my opinion, factory, the half-ton plant, sort of design, efficiency. And what helped convince our executives that you could have both was actually another Albert Kahn building, where at the Ethel plant in Ferndale, good architecture was both modern and simple and inspiring. Now, Harley Earl had to find the architect for the Tech Center, and he went around to different architecture schools and architecture firms asking opinions, and he found that the Saarinen in GM's own backyard were universally recommended. Now, Eliel Saarinen at this point is a sort of elder statesman of American design. He had established himself with his reputation of building and leading Cranbrook, and he was known as a city planner. So the sort of city-size scale of the Tech Center was very much in Saarinen's wheelhouse. We see Saarinen here with his son on his left, with Joe Lacey on the right, looking at a model for the riverfront proposal in Detroit. And this was how Saarinen preferred to convey his architectural ideas: large-scale, room-sized models. And it was with a model in 1945 that the Saarinen and Swanson Design Tech Center was unveiled. Now, I say Saarinen and Swanson because the first tech center was a design between Eliel and his son-in-law, Bob Swanson. Aero simply served as a consultant. Now, GM rolls out all the stops in the debut of this new technical center. And if you look behind our happy executives here on the wall, you'll see a series of drawings by Hugh Ferris. Now, Hugh Ferris was an important American architect, illustrator, and poet from St. Louis who worked in New York City and is known for his nighttime sort of soft focus renderings and his utopian visions for New York City. He's the kind of renderer that you hire to convey a very certain atmosphere of a project for the client. And with this proposal, really led by Eliel and Bob Swanson, we see the basic outline of the tech center. You have a vehicular entrance running underneath an administration building. On the south side of a man-made lake, you have a center of design. Then on the eastern edge, engineering, and at the top, research. And then in the center of the man-made lake is a water tower. Interesting, this scheme proposes the division between automobiles and pedestrians. And so you have the cars sort of running through and under this secondary level where it's full of plazas and piazzas. The buildings would have been glass and gray concrete. And they have these sort of airfoil designs, these very curvilinear art moderne features that would have been right at home in that 1939 World's Fair. But really, by the time the project was finished in 1945, the design was already rather dated by the time that these renderings are coming out. It is really rather romantic in this sort of futuristic energy. And Jay Merkel, a Saarinen scholar, proposes that this is sort of Eliel and Bob trying to design in Aero Saarinen style. And that through Ferris's dramatically lit renderings, they look more like movie sets than sort of actual buildings. Either way, General Motors is convinced this is the project to go for, and they break ground on the technical center in 1945. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which design you like better, as soon as they break down, construction costs are skyrocketing. You have inflation in the post-war period. And once President Truman releases wartime wage freezes, Walter Reuther demands the corporation opens its books and 30% wage increases are given to GM employees. The strike cripples the company and also stops work on the tech center. So that in October of 1946, even though already roads and infrastructure, because there were no sewers, there was no sort of power lines, that was already under construction in Warren. But in October of 1946, Saarinen and Swanson are paid out of their contract, and the project is put on indefinite hold. Now, what happens with the family firm is pretty significant because in the 3-year pause between that first design and the start of construction and the resumption of the project, there will be a series of campus buildings completed by Saarinen, Swanson, and Saarinen, modernist universities here in the Midwest that begin to show Aero Saarinen's aesthetic significantly more than his father. It also drives a wedge between brother and brother-in-law, where, as one person at the firm said, we will make money on Eliel's job and we'll lose it on Aero's. And so the family firm does split up. At the same time, Aero Saarinen wins the competition to design the Gateway Arch, and Eliel Saarinen wins America's highest honor in architecture, the AIA Gold Medal. He wins it before Frank Lloyd Wright, Walter Gropius, or Mies van der Rohe, but it does sort of cement Eliel's role as the senior statesman of design, but also as someone who is retiring from active design work. And so when General Motors comes back to work for the Saarinens, they find an entirely different organizational structure. Swanson is gone, the son is here, and Eliel has to convince the company to trust his 38-year-old son with this design. Now, Kettering wants to run away and give the commission to Albert Kahn, but Eliel, in a meeting here at Saarinen House, convinces the GM executives to trust Aero Saarinen's design. Now, Aero Saarinen, instead of falling over like a grateful son, he tells the executives, "I'm glad you're going to stick with us, and I'm also redesigning your project." And so using his brother-in-law's basic layout, because again, those pipes were already laid, Arrow begins to re-sketch the technical center. He loses those curving foils, the art moderne streamlined edges, and he proposes a system of modular buildings. Arrow's pencil sketches are refined by Glenn Paulson, who has a really amazing ability to sketch architectural ideas. And already the popular press is picking up on the significance of what will become a $100 million project. And so you see Paulson's sketch in Cranbrook Archives of the cover of Architectural Forum from 1949. When the project runs in Forum later that summer, the unnamed author praises the vision of the GM Tech Center. He says, "The architecture here takes a forward leap due to no straining towards the special or spectacular. General Motors and their architects have managed to translate everyday, ordinary industrial buildings, no trimmings, no special shapes, into architectural eloquence. Here is an object lesson in what architecture can do on realistic grounds, an advancement of thoughtfulness instead of expenditure, of analysis instead of fancy." That's before the building's ever built. Arrow's proposal straightens out the lake. He increases the size of the waterway. He also adds the administration building not over a roadway, but now over the body of water. As Arrow would later write, "When the GM people first came to my father, they probably thought and imagined they would get something like Cranbrook. But this problem was a different one. The whole spirit of what GM stood for was a different one. The time was a different one." And so what has been called a corporate Cranbrook is similar in the use of water, art, landscape, and architecture, but it is a very different architectural expression. As Saarinen continues to refine the design, the administration building is pulled from the project and it's replaced with a 115-foot long by 50-foot high water fountain as the vertical focal point. And you begin to see the increase in density of some 13,000 trees planted around the campus by Edward Eichstadt, the same landscape architect who landscaped Cranbrook, here creating this sort of idea of the campus as an opening in a meadow. Again, there's basically nothing on the site. And so they're constructing a water feature, constructing a landscape, and then arranging the buildings in a modular form around the campus. Eero Saarinen always claimed he was inspired by the industrial architecture of Albert Kahn, but he was quite clearly inspired by the romantic sort of structural integrity of the architecture of Mies van der Rohe. Mies was the last president of the Bauhaus in Germany, and he came to America in 1937. He reformed the Armour Institute in Chicago into the Illinois Institute of Technology and moved their campus into 6 blocks of urban renewal, and he filled it with pristine 24-foot modular buildings of steel, brick, and glass. Now, Mies's campus is much smaller. It would fit almost entirely in the lake at General Motors, but this was the comparison that critics and now historians continue to make. But there are as many differences as similarities. Mies's campus was one of pedestrian scale design and of universal architectural language. He never deviates from his system of construction. GM, on the other hand, is huge by comparison, designed at the car scale, and it has those theatrical moments that begin to break the grid. I mentioned that it was sometimes called a corporate Cranbrook, and you can see these similarities of father and son, except that Cranbrook 2 is designed as this sort of utopian enclave of handicraft and of arts and crafts, meant to be experienced at the scale of the body and not the scale of the car. And so we have this iterative design process where Eero is designing the campus, designing the layout, and then designing individual elements. And he is working with architectural models. And so he begins to design the stairs for the lobby. Arrow felt that the lobby of each building was where staff would receive pride on the individuality of its organization. And he called these stairways ornamental elements, like large-scale technological sculptures. There aren't a ton of modernists who would say that a stairway could be an ornamental element or a technological sculpture. But Arrow really saw this as bringing life into an otherwise very rigorous modern construction. In order to actually pull off the building of the tech center, Eero Saarinen had to partner with a larger firm. He called up his good friend Minoru Yamasaki, who had moved to Detroit in 1945 to head design at Smith, Hinchman and Grills. He asked Yamasaki what firm is big enough, capable enough to do this, to take my designs and turn them into working drawings. Yamasaki would set up an entire separate office at Smith, Hinchman and Grills that would employ some 125 architects, engineers, and draftspeople to work on the tech center. And so Saarinen would send designs to Smith, Hinchman and Grill, and Smith, Hinchman and Grills would turn it into working construction documents. Yamasaki would head off to St. Louis during the construction of the project, but Smith, Hinchman and Grills really is the sort of technical know-how to actually get this project built. The entire campus, these rectilinear blocks, are extraordinarily systematic. It is an architecture of systemized construction, where the grid of the structure is housing underneath a plastic ceiling all of the systems. So a speaker system, electrical, mechanical, plumbing, fire suppression, and the air conditioning is all being held in a 5-foot gridded ceiling. Then the walls are completely independent except at the exterior. And so you can tilt up and move these 10-foot panels. And the paneled walls that you see drawn here, they could be solid wood, they could have a door, they could be glass. And so the buildings are essentially the same sort of Albert Kahn empty factory of Henry Ford in the assembly line, but now used for design and research offices. Everything was tested before it was built in Warren. And so here you see a mock-up of 2 different types of lighting baffles. The 5-foot stainless steel grid is supporting plexiglass panels that are tilted up. And then those holes that are coming down are allowing the air conditioning to come through the ceiling system. Once constructed, you can see how the panels, which were made in Cleveland, and shipped in the order of their installation by train car. The panels are tilted in, they attach to the ceiling, and you have this sort of universal illuminated surface. Now, this grid will run through all of the buildings, and it was designed by Warren Plattner, one of Eero Saarinen's associates. The ceiling grid was one of the great innovations. The other was the wall system, the curtain walls. Many architects, including Eero Saarinen, had proposed a system of construction that would allow you to build the frame, the columns and beams, and then fill it with panels. Panels of what? That was the great experiment. For the tech center, Eero uses war technology of porcelain enameled steel. And so these are, this is a mock-up of the steel and glass panels, and here we see them installing it. These were 2-inch thick sandwiches that were at the center honeycombed craft paper, and then faced with 20-pound gauge steel sheets with porcelain enamel, and then filled with an insulating non-combustible material like perlite. These were rigid and weatherproof, and they were made by a Chrysler plant, eventually made in Massachusetts. So you build the building, you tilt in the panels, and then you also have windows. And here, Saarinen wanted to use neoprene gaskets to install the windows. These are the same gaskets that hold a windshield on your car, and he worked with General Motors research to create die-formed neoprene to hold the windows in. The glass itself was reflecting. After John Dinkeloo and Kevin Roche saw sunglasses on the cover of Look magazine, they asked, why can't a building have sunglasses? The manufacturers in Toledo laughed at them until one didn't. And there we had the invention of double-paned reflective glass. And that becomes this sort of standard curtain wall construction that will transform architecture in the 20th century, experimented and developed here at the Tech Center. Now, the end caps were the bricks. Aero wanted special bright bricks, but there were none on the market. And so he went to another great company that his father had used, the brick companies, the Wyandotte Clay companies of Upper Sandusky, Ohio. And he asked for unglazed bricks. He gave them to the head of Cranbrook's ceramics department, Maya Grotel. And Grotel developed a series of glaze recipes that were able to be absorbed by the brick and fired in her Cranbrook kiln. When these were taken to General Motors and Aero said, this is what I want us to make, GM asked how much. He said, 3 times the cost of a normal brick, but it will be worth it. But you also have to build a custom kiln to actually get these made. GM went for it, and the Claycraft Company built built the kiln and then fired 11 different colored bricks. And the color schemes were developed by Alexander Gerard, who we'll learn much more about next week. Now, the styling dome is one of the most important elements on the campus, and it was suggested in the earliest plans of the Tech Center, refined in its design by Kevin Roche, and then engineered with Smith, Hinchman, and Grills in the Chicago Bridge and Iron Company. And they constructed it over a series of months, and it is a sort of double-framed eggshell system worked out really as a sort of bridge system within aluminum shingles over the entire 64-foot height. When it came to the inside of the buildings, the scale of the project really would have overwhelmed any one architecture firm. And so interiors were a joint effort between the Office of Eero Saarinen and GM Styling Architecture and Interior Studios under Harley Earl. The lobbies, auditorium, and restaurants were designed by Saarinen with styling consulting. The offices and libraries were designed together, and executive offices and executive dining rooms were designed by General Motors. The interiors featured wide, clear span space with illuminated ceilings. And in the styling departments designed in-house, you have these sort of wonderful examples and well-publicized examples of, here is where your car is designed in this beautiful space, much more sort of sculptural than what Eero Saarinen designed elsewhere for the engineers. But to actually produce the furniture, we introduced one of the most important members of Eero Saarinen's circle, Florence Schust. And here we see Florence Schust, later Florence Knoll, with Eliel Saarinen. Florence was from Saginaw, Michigan, and she was orphaned at the age of 12. Her guardian took her around to different boarding schools in America, and when she saw Kingswood under construction here at Cranbrook, she knew she did not need to look any further. She wanted to live in this remarkable, brand new environment. At Kingswood, she studied under the art direction of Rachel DeWolf Rossen. And Rossen was the first woman graduate of Cornell's architecture program. She could not become an architect because of sexism in the industry. So she was teaching at Kingswood School, Cranbrook. Florence knew she wanted to be an architect, and she did a series of projects to make a portfolio to present to Eliel Saarinen. The Saarinens practically adopted this young, talented woman, and she would spend her summers in Finland being taught architecture history by Eero Saarinen and being shown architecture and introduced to architects by Eliel. She graduated from Cranbrook's High School and studied at the Art Academy under Eliel. On the recommendation of Alvar Aalto, she then studies at the Architecture Association in London before returning because of war to the IIT in Chicago, where she studies under Mies, and then heads out to Boston to study under Gropius. So that by the age of 24, Florence Knoll has had contact or study under pretty much every modern master. She goes to New York and is working as an architect when she joins in partnership with the German immigrant Hans Knoll, who came from a long line of furniture makers and designers and builders, and they became professional and then personal partners. In 1946, Florence Knoll opened the Knoll Planning Unit, which was an interior planning arm of what was then H.G. Knoll Associates. Although small in size, the planning unit became renowned for its shaping of the business of the corporate American interior. And it really begins with her role designing General Motors. Here you can see her designing the Connecticut General Life Insurance, the sole woman in this room full of male executives and designers. And for the planning unit, Knoll needed furniture. She wanted to design modern corporate interiors, but there was not modern American furniture. And she did not want to have to rely on German or Scandinavian modern designs. Who would she turn to design her furniture? But her Cranbrook classmates. And remember, last week we saw the early experiments in molded plywood modern furniture coming out of the studio of Charles Eames and Eero Saarinen. And in 1948, Florence commissions essentially her older brother figure, Eero Saarinen, to design the first collaboration between Saarinen and Knoll, the Grasshopper chair, a prototype seen on the left, and then the Model 70 series, which is most famous for its Model 70, the Womb chair, an early prototype photographed here at Cranbrook on the right. And the Model 70 series was meant to be chairs at all different scales. And these little hand models were made by Eero Saarinen. He would make these alongside his architectural practice. And the 70 series included a small side chair. And this chair, like the Womb chair, was formed out of plastic. There were not that many companies making plastic anything. And so the Saarinen and Florence Knoll headed to Trenton, New Jersey, to boat builders' workshops, where they compelled the boat builders to start making these sisal reinforced plastic chair backs. And you can see here a worker sanding down the edge from where this has been demolded from its plastic form. Now, Florence later said that it was quite scary to face the first real test of Eero's designs in such a big commission as General Motors. The problem was that Eero had designed the Womb chair, he had designed the Model 72, which was a side chair, but they needed an armchair for all of the many offices. Eero attempted to make the Model 72 into an armchair, but the plastic was too flimsy and it simply would break or not support your arm. And he's designing desk chairs for, General Motors designers and executives. And so he looks at Florence's own design catalog, and he's inspired by a chair that Florence designed in 1946 for the Rockefeller family. Florence had wanted a fully upholstered round back armchair. She could not find one on the market, and so she designed this one. Florence would say she was not a furniture designer. She simply created the pieces that were missing from the market. Eero, with her permission, takes this chair as his inspiration, and his collaborator, Niels Diffrient, creates a full-size clay mock-up. Now, Niels Diffrient was a design student at Cranbrook. He had won a General Motors automobile competition, and he applied to work at Eero Saarinen and Associates as a designer. But he showed up with a clay model, and Eero hired him as his furniture collaborator. Now, Niels Diffrient would write later that the way it worked was that Eero would bring in those small models. He would give Niels 2 weeks to create 18 or 20 different versions of those models. Eero would come in, reject most of them, say, do this. 2 weeks later, he would work it out again and again, this iterative collaboration, until they had produced the models 70, 72, 73, and in the front of this image, the model 76, which was the secretary's chair for General Motors. It's a little bit unclear how many of these chairs were designed specifically for General Motors and how many were designed because General Motors needed the chair. So there's a little bit of ambiguity as to what in the Model 70 series was coming out of Florence's desire to have it in the catalog for Knoll and what was coming out of this one specific monumental commission. But we do know the Model 76 was requested by GM to have a 2-part secretary's chair. These chairs are all still in production and are some of the most successful furniture forms ever produced for the American corporate interior. And as we look through the interior of the Tech Center, you'll see that Knoll designs are everywhere, from the double-wide Womb settees in the research or the styling library to the offices with their Model 72 or 71s, to the styling center where you see the sort of appropriateness of Knoll's design, Knoll and Saarinen's design, even in the context of a car seat design next to it. or in the cafeteria where you have plastic-backed Model 72s sitting underneath Harry Bertoia's great screen. Now, Harry Bertoia, who designed this large metal screen, was an Italian immigrant who came to America in 1930. He studied at Cass Tech in Detroit before studying at the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts. In 1936, he came to Cranbrook, where he studied design, and then reopened the metal shop in 1939. Now, Harry Bertoia created silver for Cranbrook, teapots, plates. He also created jewelry that was the sort of must-have item among Bloomfield Hills ladies. He also created models for the students, and it was Bertoia who actually would make Eames and Saarinen's little chair models. Now, Harry Bertoia was one of the most successful Cranbrook designers and Cranbrook teachers, and students like Jane Van Austin would leave the studio of Harry Bertoia to go and work at General Motors. In 1943, Bertoia headed west to work for Eames, where he helped develop the molded plywood furniture, before being hired by Hans and Florence Knoll to work as an in-house Knoll designer in 1950. He moved into this barn in Bartow, Pennsylvania, where he designed furniture and sculpture. And it was on a visit to Knoll's studio where Aero and Aline saw Bertoia's small screen sculptures. And Aero said, "My old friend Harry, won't you make this much larger?" And so for the Tech Center, he designs a sort of over 30-foot long version of this sculpture, which stands at the entrance of the main cafeteria. Now, for Knoll, he designs a series of wire chairs that become landmarks in their own right, and these too would be specified and used at the General Motors Technical Center. And it was through General Motors that the chair, which had been powder coated in black or white, becomes chrome plated. And it's one of our circle members today, Gere Kavanaugh, who is the first to suggest to Hans Knoll, "Won't you send me an unfinished Bertoia wire chair?" And then she marched it down to the General Motors chrome vats and said, "Instead of doing car bumpers, can you do this chair?" And that launched the sort of Knoll chrome plated Bertoia diamond chair. Not all the furniture at the Tech Center comes out of Knoll. Some comes just from the studio of Eero Saarinen. Working with Niels Different, he designs these lounge chairs, as well as the office desk designed here by Warren Plattner. These pieces were made locally and reflect the sort of high quality of skill sets here in Metro Detroit. There were many components in the Tech Center that, though they were serially produced at a big scale, they were not mass produced. And so Saarinen was really relying on workshop and family-owned businesses to get custom doorknobs, custom hinges, custom furniture built for the Tech Center. And when you see it all in place, the sculptural stair, the plywood ceiling, the custom glazed brick walls, the furniture, we see one of our most important components here on the interior, the textiles. These were produced by Marianne Strengell, who was head of Cranbrook's weaving department from 1942 to 1961. She succeeded Eero's mother as head of the department, and she was hired in 1951 as a consultant for Eero Saarinen and Associates. She worked with Warren Plattner on the color schemes of the interiors, as well as producing these massive hand-woven rugs. They were designed by Strengell and hand-woven by Gerda Nyberg, who was a Swedish immigrant weaver who came to Cranbrook in the 1930s to weave the rugs for Kingswood School under Loya Saarinen. So you see this sort of continuous tradition of Cranbrook's early history coming right up to the Tech Center. Now, when Harley Earl saw the rugs on the floor of the Tech Center, he asked Strengell, "How much did I pay for those?" And she said, $2,500 for a pair. And he responded, "Good God, that's the price of a new Chevrolet." But the rugs did last for many decades, and they did add this sort of softness to the building that was otherwise glass, steel, and stone. You can see here Strengell with Loya Saarinen and Eero Saarinen. They were long family friends. The Saarinens had known Strengell's parents and known her since she was a young woman. Now, Strengell not only does hand weaving and teaching at Cranbrook, but she also designs for industry. And so you could hypothetically go to work at the Tech Center, walk across a Strengell hand-woven rug, and then get in your car and be sitting on a Strengell mass-produced sort of textile for the auto industry. Seen here, her Taj Mahal line from the 1959 Lincoln Continental. Now, as her career progressed, she continued to balance hand weaving and industry. Here is one of her landmark textiles, the forecast rug, made of spun aluminum. And I hope you had the chance to see this on display at Cranbrook last summer. Strengell will stay close to Eero Saarinen Associates, and later she will marry Olav Hammarström, who was another Finnish immigrant and one of Eero's designers, and they would retire to Wellfleet into this pretty perfect little summer cottage full of Strengell's furniture and textiles and Olav Hammarström's architecture. Now, the other great faculty member involved in the Tech Center was Maya Grotel, who I already discussed her work on the bricks. The outside colors of the building were really determined by Eero Saarinen and Grotel and Alexander Gerard. On the inside, it was the domain of the stylist, and you see here the DuPont classified color selector, which is how they would choose the color for the different GM products. And in order to get natural light against the DuPont classified color selector, Eero Saarinen builds a small light well. And in the center was a fountain, a sculpture by James McCormick, but around the interior were handmade ceramic planters, handmade in Grotel's Cranbrook studios, and then mounted on these little stainless steel rods. Again, the intersection of sort of mass production and the handmade. Outside, again, even the water was more playful than you first expect. In front of the research building, Alexander Calder's fountain, Fantel Seven Sisters Plops and Scissors, used 21 jets to pump 3,600 gallons a minute, 40 feet high, in variable pressures to create a dancing water fountain, illuminated at night in Calder's signature red, yellow, and blue. Or in the styling building, the back wall features a painting, Lines in Motion, by Buell Mullen, in front of the teacup desk by Kevin Roche. And when Kevin Roche designed this, I think you get a sense he was in a hurry. He sends off the sketch to Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, and he sort of just hopes, I hope her legs actually fit in this desk. But again, the idea that the architecture, the art, and the furnishings are all contributing to this overall design. In the styling dining room, we see Warren Plattner's use of bright orange as well as plants with the Model 72 chairs. Next to the employee, the styling employee dining room, is the executive dining room, where a massive 10-foot solid teak table designed by Carl Binkert, who is a General Motors designer, featured a automated rotating Lazy Susan, and then a planter in the center. And here we see another sort of member of Eero Saarinen's circle, Ruth Adler Schnee. She had studied with Eliel Saarinen at Cranbrook, and she was designing textiles and running a home goods store with her husband, Edward Schnee, at the time she got a call from Saarinen's office. Morris Jackson, an employee of Eero Saarinen, asked her, can you furnish what we need for the executive dining room? She asked, what do you want? And he said, well, we want wonderful stuff, and hung up the phone. She selected a mix of custom textiles, as well as Gordon Fraser stainless steel bowls, creamer, sugar, salt and pepper, a salt and warming tray, and then Rosenthal china. Now, Schnee, whose work we can also see here on the sideboard, originally designed an upholstered ceiling for this room, but it was rejected by Harley Earl, who replaced it with a domed teak ceiling designed in-house by General Motors. Now, Ruth Adler Schnee is a really significant and fascinating member of the sort of Cranbrook design legacy. She's seen here in her 12th Street showroom, where she and her husband would screen print fabrics as well as sell modern European design to the Detroit community. But Schnee's background was getting to this moment was really quite an amazing series of events and work. She was born in Frankfurt and to an important Jewish family of antiques dealers and book dealers. And on Kristallnacht, her home was destroyed and her family's collection of modern art cut up and her Biedermeier furniture smashed. Her mother had studied at the Bauhaus and was an important sort of intellectual in the Frankfurt area, and her father had served in World War I and was a respected businessman. He was taken to Dachau, and her mother waited until she could help get her husband out of the concentration camp before the family fled for America in 1939. She studied at Cass Tech, where she designed fashion and used her portfolio of art as a high schooler to get a full ride to the Rhode Island School of Design. It was there she studied architecture, but she could not get a job as a Jewish woman in architecture. She then uses a competition at RISD to enter into a Vogue-sponsored competition that should have taken her to Paris. She wins out of over 1,000 entries, and she wins with her design for an apartment that, and this was the challenge from Vogue, used the typical assortment of gifts for a modern wedding party to design a cohesive interior. She wins the prize from Vogue, and they place her, instead of in Paris, in the antiques division of Lord & Taylor. She lasts 2 days before she marches back down to Condé Nast and says, "This isn't what I want." And they find her a position at the studio of Raymond Loewy. The industrial designer employed about 50 architects and designers, and Ruth Adler Schnee joined as the only woman. She sat between Minoru Yamasaki and Warren Plattner. And in 1945, for assortment of reasons, all three end up leaving Raymond Loewy's studio and coming to Detroit. Yamasaki and Plattner to Smith, Hinchman and Grill. Plattner then heads on to Eero Saarinen, and Ruth Adler Schnee on scholarship to Cranbrook. She was the first Jewish woman to receive a scholarship and the first Jewish woman to graduate from the design department. At Cranbrook, she studies architecture. She tries to get a job with Albert Kahn, but as a woman, she's still denied entry into that field. She wins a competition to design upholstery fabric for architectural interiors. Over 1,600 entries, and she wins. And this sets her up onto a career as a textile designer. She says that design is excruciating, but she believes good design is the art of problem solving. One has to create aesthetic unity of pattern, color, and texture to address human needs. If that has been accomplished, it will never go out of style. And as we look at the screen of Ruth's designs from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I do think that she was able to tap into this real sort of dynamic and timeless aesthetic. She gets pretty well regarded as a textile designer, though it does not bring the sort of financial rewards that I think she and Edward were hoping. And here we see some of her textiles as displayed in Life magazine in 1954. She and her husband then open up a design shop in Detroit, and they become community leaders of bringing design, high quality interior home goods to Metro Detroit. And Adler Schnee would be here in Harmony Park from 1964 to 1977. And Ruth sort of runs a constant stream of very creative PR stunts and advertisements, as well as community festivals and dinners. They closed the store in 1977. And Ruth has continued to design interiors and textiles. And today, at the age of 96, she is still designing textiles for Knoll. And I believe she's on the screen tonight. So thank you, Ruth, for being here. Now, I also want to celebrate one other living designer who's part of Eero Saarinen's circle. And unlike our others who are really associated most prominently with Eero Saarinen and Associates, Gere Kavanaugh was actually employed by General Motors. She was one of what GM's PR team called the Damsels of Design. And these were members of the styling group who worked under Harley Earl, designing graphics, model kitchens, trade show displays, and cars. It was one of the few celebrated examples of women designers in industry. And Gere Kavanaugh worked at General Motors from her Cranbrook graduation until about 1958. She grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and she studied at the Memphis Academy of Art from age 8 to 22 when she graduated with a BA and came to Cranbrook to study for a year. At Cranbrook, she made books, furniture, textiles, as well as children's books and jewelry, lighting, and toys. She also intriguingly babysat Eero Saarinen's kids, and she sat with Loya Saarinen and helped be a companion to the architect's mother. Now, during her Cranbrook years, she knew that Arrow's architects, particularly Kevin Roche and Warren Plattner, would head to the Bloomfield Hills barbecue late at night. And so she would go with her design students and just happen to bump into Eero Saarinen's associates as a student. She goes to work for GM, where she designs interiors like this one, as well as designing panelized inserts for some of the Knoll furniture, showing the way that these companies and General Motors collaborated. Her, I think, magnum opus at GM, in my opinion, is the 1958 Feminine Auto Show, which GM branded as By Ladies for Ladies. And it was cars with vanities, umbrella holders, and smooth round surfaces to prevent nylon snags. The sort of limitations and gender expectations very much are being performed here, but it's also giving Gere Kavanaugh an enormous international stage on which to show her design aesthetic. She rents these potted hyacinths, which fill the design dome with aroma of a French garden, and then she hangs nylon in bright flame and orange from the ceiling. And at the center, those are netted canary cages where she rented 100 canaries to chirp throughout the entire show. And this was a smashing success in the popular press. And it leads Gere Kavanaugh to go and work for Victor Gruen, the great mall architect. Now, Kavanaugh recalls that she rented 100 canaries and returned 99, so one canary did get out into the dome. She applies to work for Eero Saarinen and Victor Gruen. She doesn't know which one, and then she sees Los Angeles, and she has never returned to Michigan. For Gruen, she designs a similar bird cage on the left for the world's first enclosed shopping center, and on the right, a clock at the Midtown Plaza. In 1964, she breaks out from Victor Gruen with fellow associate Frank Gehry, and Gehry and Gere Kavanaugh set up shop in a warehouse in Los Angeles. Gehry, of course, will go on to his own illustrious career, but they remain friends. And Kavanaugh doesn't limit herself to one's take of design. When asked what she designed, she said, everything. And so she tackles problems at all different scale, from on the left, sort of store design, product design for a shop, to on the right, a mall, where again, you have this sort of celebratory hanging of textiles and kites, similar to her early work at General Motors. She designs toys, architectural toys like this city planning toy prototype, and she is still designing in Los Angeles. Here's a more recent product for CB2 of Christmas ornaments and displays. Now, these are just some of the members of the circle who shape this American industrial Versailles, this transformational project. More are as equally important as all of these individual stories and designs were, was also the role that this campus played in shaping the future of corporate architecture in America and Eero Saarinen's own commissions. This becomes the first great company, great sort of suburban expansion of a company. And throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we'll see numerous Fortune 500 companies leave downtown campuses for suburban corporate kind of enclaves in the manner of the tech center. For Eero Saarinen, he designed 2 of these campuses for IBM, and in New Jersey for Bell Laboratories, and in rural Illinois for John Deere. Members of his office would continue the tradition, with Edward Charles Bassett of SOM designing corporations in the Pacific Northwest, and then other architects like Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill, who Eero viewed not as his competition until he finished GM, would expand the language of the suburban corporate campus well into the 20th century. And in Gordon Bunshaft's Connecticut General Life Insurance Company, we see again the legacy of Florence Knoll and her Knoll Planning Unit, who established the entire sort of design ethos of this landmark mid-century modern corporate headquarters. Now, Smith, Hinchman, and Grills would also use the success and the technologies developed at the Tech Center to build their own suburban campuses, like the Michigan Telephone Company Staff Center in Southfield, or the rather brooding and ominous Kmart Corporation headquarters on Big Beaver Road. Now, Smith, Hinchman, and Grills is still involved at the Tech Center. The Tech Center is embarking now on a major restoration of the campus and expansion. As I mentioned, they own some 900 acres in Warren, and there are many different additions and subsequent buildings that have expanded across in the language of Eero Saarinen, this 5-foot gridded module, these curtain wall systems. And now General Motors is reinvesting in its historic architecture, and they have recently completely refurbished and updated the styling dome. Much of the furniture is still being used in the Tech Center, and its influence on the sort of design of corporate America cannot be overstated. I think in this lecture I showed you this, I hope to have shown you this radical shift in scale of Eero Saarinen and Associates, starting as basically a 10-person design firm led by Eliel Saarinen, and in just about 6 short years, transforming into a 100-person office with Eero Saarinen at the center of an elaborate constellation of architects and designers, all working in this sort of breakneck method of design. Next week, we are going to take a slightly different look at Eero Saarinen as we study the house he designed for Cummins Engines company president Irwin Miller in Columbus, Indiana. And so next week, we'll talk more about Alexander Gerard, Balthazar Korab, Florence Knoll, and many other of the designers, and the way that modernism, which we saw so beautifully examined tonight at General Motors, the way that modernism enters into the home. Well, if you have other questions, you are welcome to email me or message me on Instagram anytime during the week. If you have suggestions to the lectures, or if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. And if you have pronunciation guides, I learned just this morning that the Racemans are pronounced Rossen, and that Aileen Saarinen was named after her father Al and went by Aline, and that's going to be a hard one to shift. But I do appreciate those of you who know this material in a personal manner or in a scholarly manner. Do reach out. I appreciate hearing from all of you. We'll be back next Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern for our look at Eero Saarinen and the Circle building the Miller House in Columbus, Indiana.